Welcome, everyone. I'm Nandita Correa Merotra, and on behalf of the Charles Correa Foundation, I welcome you to this evening's event, the Gold Medal Award Ceremony 2023. The Gold Medal is given to the best thesis project across India, and this year, the 25th year of the medal, we had asked the students to address the provocation put forward by Charles. A form follows climate. The award winners have been selected by a jury of 5 architects, and we will hear from them shortly. But Charles would lead the jury for many years. He was sort of very, very much part of the whole the sort of process, and he designed the medal. So the gold medalist will have one of those especially minted medals. But to begin and to celebrate the event and to share some amazing examples of form follows climate, responding to nature and the environment, we have Marion Weiss and Michael Manfredi, co-founders of the New York-based firm Weiss Manfredi, to share with us their work. The lecture is titled Architecture, Climate, and Other Reciprocities, as their work seemingly effortlessly blends, I think, nature with built form, responding to climate and the broader context of site. Building in infrastructure projects, which are a synthesis, a true collaboration, I think, between the several design disciplines, landscape, engineering, urban design, and architecture. And the buildings too bring together with amazing clarity, I think, the elegant design solution, the public and private spheres of the building. I visited the Diana Center, which is a multi-use arts building in New York at the Barnard College. And this, it creates spaces for students to work in privacy, but also at times to be viewed publicly in a series of sort of cascading spaces which make the spine of the building. Their work is truly remarkable, and I'm really looking forward to seeing their presentation of their work, and including the recently completed extension to the US Embassy in New Delhi, which is developing a campus around the original Edward Durrell Stone building from the late 50s. Marion Weiss is a professor of practice at the University of Pennsylvania. And in 2017, Marion was honored by Architectural Record with the Women in Architecture Design Leader Award. She has studied at Yale and has a bachelor's degree from University of Virginia. She's taught at many universities, at Harvard, Yale, Cornell, and since I think the early 1990s has been faculty at Penn. And in 2019, a few years ago, Marion and Michael received the Residence Fellowship at the American Academy in Rome, which is really a fantastic honor and a wonderful place to work from and to sort of be able to be part of, I think. Michael Manfredi is a senior design critic at Harvard University. Michael was born in Italy and grew up in Rome, so very, very lucky person to be, have that amazing sort of environment to grow up in. He completed his undergraduate at here in the US at Notre Dame, and then did his master's at Cornell. He's also won a number of prizes. The Paris Prize, was a Cornell Fellow, has taught design studios, also at Yale, Penn, Princeton, Cornell, and more recently at Harvard University, where he teaches urban design studios. both Marion and Michael have been recipients of the award in architecture from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, and many other awards. They have exhibited at MoMA, at Museum of Modern Art in New York, the Venice Biennale, the Architectural Biennale, the Guggenheim Museum, the Sao Paulo Biennale. You know, I mean, sort of great honor to have them here with us. And so welcome, Marion and Michael, and I hand over the mic to you.
Thank you, Nandita. It's an honor to be here, and thank you for such a gracious introduction. Sometimes in hearing your introduction, I think Mary and I were wondering who exactly you were talking about, but thank you again. We have put together some slides, and maybe we'll start with I think the fact that it is indeed an honor to be speaking with you all I think in the context of the foundation and our extremely high regard for Charles Correa's work. And in thinking about his work now, done a number of years ago, he wrote a number of articles that have been important to us. We realized that in a way, he had set a kind of set the bar extraordinarily high, and it continues to be inspirational. I think the takeaway, of course, is that beautiful architecture and architecture is responsive to its environment and climate. These are not antithetical ideas, but they are woven together in what I think is, in the example of his work, a seamless whole. So that's to say we are following in the footsteps of someone who we admire greatly. I think it goes without saying our world is getting smaller. It's getting smaller and more intense. So the issues of climate are no longer something that we can think about as occurring in other exotic settings. In a way, the kind of crises that we're facing, the challenges we're facing, means that architecture has agency, has a kind of a responsibility that is, I think, we hope for all of us, inspiring rather than depressing. So it's our great duty in some ways that Mary and I feel we're privileged to be able to try to effect a change. And no longer can we think of a kind of single solution to all the world's climate problems. Rather, we love to look at great examples, including Indian stepwells, for example, that have found ways in which the local specifics of a climate and a terrain can be given great beauty and great relevance.
And, you know, what is so interesting for us is when we think about the idea of form follows climate, which is really the kind of thesis of this cycle of the thesis jury. Our own work, we brought together the idea of public natures and the idea that infrastructure needs to evolve and it needs to become public in nature and it needs to be responsive to climate. And in fact, in the fall, our book, Drifting Symmetries, Projects, Provocations, and Other Enduring Models, is really looking precisely at that possibility now, that we need to be able to both embrace changing climates and recognize that we're going to build and create spaces that are public very differently because climate has changed. And in thinking about what that might mean to evolve and what our evolutionary infrastructure is going to look like, we'll begin with the Brooklyn Botanic Garden as a project that in many ways tries to marry the question of what is both urban and what is nature, and can there be a reciprocity that is yet to be imagined?
No.
And as we think about it, in Brooklyn, 100% urban and paved on one side, and in the interior of this 52-acre garden, a beautiful yet nearly invisible destination. And for us, the question was not so much trying to change or add a new building to this garden, but to connect the city into the garden and change that experience of waiting in line. As you can see, 44,000 people on Mother's Day trying to go through a portal. But instead of saying enter through the parking lot, why not in fact create an origami of urbanism and nature, and think about that as a transition. It could be 100% urban at one side as it reaches the city, and 100% natural on the other. And that portal is as generous as possible to invite you into a realm that is an inhabitable topography that begins from garden and city and brings you through a space that is illuminated now by shade and shadow, by choices to move left to the city and right to the garden, and to consider even geometries of the building that avoid the drip line of a rare flowering green cherry tree. And think about a passage through a space or a visitor center as a place that brings you more in touch with the light of the nature around you rather than exclusively or isolated to tell that story. And even thinking about, in this case, a two-sided room that is embedded in the topography so that there's a journey above that you can see through the clear story and a destination inside.
So at times the building whispers. It's less about the architecture as an object, but more about the architecture as its setting. You can start to see how the topography of the building is nested into a berm, thereby reducing the energy consumption. But it's also an acknowledgement that the preciousness of nature in some ways can supersede architecture, or in this case, become architecture, where the green roof changes depending on the dry season or the wet season. And the building itself, we hope, is a work of art, but it's also a piece of infrastructure. It's a hardworking machine to gather water. Water is precious in New York, capture it and clean it, and then use it for irrigation. And you can start to see how that kind of connection between building and garden start to work both in terms of the aesthetics of the building, but also its performative aspects. At times, the building's overtly architectural, as you can see here. It clearly is a presence. And at times, as we sort of said, it becomes completely embedded in the garden and at one with it. Now, as part of that project, about 10 years later, we were asked to make the garden a little bit more accessible for those in wheelchairs or for those who couldn't walk with a great deal of comfort. So rather than the typical ramp that you see often added to structures, we thought we would take part of this hillside, which was actually starting to kind of fail in terms of its both soil and civil engineering capacity, and develop a very long 400-foot, about 120-meter long ramp that was a very gentle ramp that would be, in effect, not a ramp, but a garden. And that construction you can start to see here take form. So it follows a very ancient tradition of terracing hillsides. And that terracing has also allowed us to develop this as less of a ramp, but more of a garden with a series of overlooks or a series of belvederes. So you can see how it works. At times, the plant material is at eye level. At times, it's down a little bit lower. But you're always aware of the topography. And the idea is to take the kind of constraints of a ramp and turn them into something pleasurable and hopefully beautiful. I'll see if the video works. We have a little video here, and there we go. Okay, well, it's skipping a little bit. I think the point is that architecture has the capacity to think about movement. And again, the pleasure of connecting architecture and nature often is through movement.
So the other question is really, what is the kind of idea of a social infrastructure? And Nandita mentioned the Barnard Building as one where we actually think at almost a landscape scale as we enter buildings to think about how to create social condensers or connectors, even in spaces as technologically secret, if you will, as a nanotechnology lab where dressing in a bunny suit is necessary for that research. But if we think at Penn and the engineering quad, in some ways, that was the driest of all, devoted to labs and very mineral, but not necessarily taking inspiration from what the city of Philadelphia and the campus of University of Pennsylvania had as identifying conveners, which are the greens. And so we started to think about the simplicity of a lab box, really being a collection of boxes located in unique ways. And in this case, actually opening up, with both a public green to gather that campus together in an identifying element of public nature. And then also, now you could see also the cantilever of the forum. But the point is that how can you actually allow the idea of research to be made legible so that that community can find each other and find each other, even if in bunny suits, looking through this amber glass that blocks out the amber rays, the UV rays that would destroy the research. But somehow, though, that amber identity is one that we think could even forge new communities to find new interests in what that very refined kind of science might do, and literally become emblematic of that possibility. Emblematic in such a way that you could have a collaborative social infrastructure where staircases, which often separate and divide, could become slow enough to have collaborative spaces from one level to another.
And in fact, that sort of multi-level idea, it brings us back to architecture's capacity to create a public setting. Even in the context of science, which is often very hermetic, there are moments in this building where the public is invited in, for example, to have conferences. And from the street, perhaps, if you know nothing about science, the magic of the building, we hope, will be a way of introducing a level of, I suppose, seduction. But the idea of making open space. By the way, this green here captures water. There's a giant cistern under this green bit of public space. Again, water is increasingly precious, not only so obviously in countries like India, but also increasingly precious in the United States and Canada.
And this brings us really to questions of climate in places where extreme climates have existed before, and they're teaching us something about our futures. In Los Angeles, you could say the paradoxic of actually the tar pits, for La Brea tar pits, really the foundation and origins of what got LA going, is really now in a city that's anxious to get to its future, and yet it's 20 million years in the making. And the paradoxical side of the tar pits is that this active site of excavation, which is active 362 days a year, is revealing the secret really of our past and on our future. And the Pleistocene being the last ice age moment where the identical pattern of climate change in a longer period of time is what we're experiencing today. So to think about weaving this together on Wilshire Boulevard, now really the cultural nexus of Los Angeles, adjacent to a series of museums, including Zumthor's Lacroix across the way, is really saying there's thousands of journeys, but maybe there's three that come into focus. With a cultural green, where we could carve into the earthwork of the existing museum, which hid all these treasures, and now reveal them in new ways and expand them to make that exhibition more compelling. And to think about crossing those tar pits, to think about them as really taking you to a world that you have never been part of, but is part of your own world.
So the idea is to take a museum, which is often very hermetic, and literally open up the treasures and connect both site and museum so you could understand the treasures inside and connect them to the active research that's occurring outside. Again, a very, very unusual project that has allowed us to create open space as well. Los Angeles, surprisingly, is very low in terms of public open space. So you see identified as a way of, in a way, organizing both the expansion and the renovation, a public green. That kind of oval becomes, in a way, the heart of the building. But it's also a sectional building. The idea that going into the earth to learn more about the last series of very intense climate changes has allowed us, I think, to think about the museum as a sort of a treasure trove or a treasure chest of active excavation. At times, the museum is very, very dark and cool. Again, thinking about the passage of time. And also, this is Los Angeles, so the fantasy of bringing that past into the present and projecting it onto a future is an opportunity to think architecturally in a way that perhaps might not be an opportunity in another context or with another kind of project.
And yet, while that is an expansive site, you could think of expansive campuses like Yale University as places where arguably the idea of thinking about identifying a place for innovative thinking is unusual. And we were invited in, again, the precinct of engineering, which has a series of lab buildings and somewhat hidden agendas to open space, to create a new, very small building, 12,000 square feet, to create a place for cross-disciplinary projects to occur. Intended to be, at least by the brief, to be in addition to the building on your right, Royer, or on the left, the lab building that you can see of Dunham. And we said instead, what if we could turn the roof of that one-story lab in the middle into a new park, into a new garden, and actually locate a lens that is as transparent as can be, in contrast to the opacity of the engineering buildings surrounding it. And so this ellipse of a building was really disguised in many ways as an opportunity to create a new landscape. You can see me standing in front of the Breuer brutalist wall, and our idea was to connect and create two landscapes, fully connected to create one courtyard that is part nature and part architecture, but mostly a place of convening, and a place of so much transparency that even this curvilinear self-supporting glass at 22 vertical feet was to be as transparent and, in a sense, a demonstration of structural strength by its curvature, to invite a community to collaborate, to, in a sense, convene across disciplines, to change that space as they needed to. You could see this right after the pandemic being, in a sense, just at the beginning of its life. But also, when privacy or sunlight needs to be blocked, the possibility of that curtain actually illuminating it, almost like the Edison bulb, where in fact you could imagine that in collaboration with the collegiate Gothic architecture, the historic modernist architecture. And what we loved is the reciprocity of the reflections of this glass, somehow hybridizing brutalism and collegiate Gothic into a new language of sort of luminous surprise.
So the west coast of Florida, where the Artist Naples Baker Museum is located, is an area that is at times very, very, very wet. There's a very significant wet season. It can be very, very hot and humid, but it's also prone to a series of hurricanes. And it's a very fragile, beautiful, but very fragile environment. So there was an existing museum that was heavily damaged during Hurricane Irma, which you see the photo on your right. So rather than completely tear down the building, we decided to bring the building down to structure, reclad it, and essentially expand the museum and create a series of more climate-appropriate responses architecturally. So this giant glass bubble that was very, very heavily damaged during the museum, we decided to take that down because it was also important to make the museum much more public. Typically, the museum had been very hermetic. And in so doing, we created a very open courtyard that could capture the prevailing breezes off the Gulf Coast. And again, this is one of Charles's great lessons, is to use climate to help shape form. So this sort of sense of creating an open gallery, in effect, that could be used when the season's appropriate, is in effect the heart of this project. So you can see taking down what had been heavily damaged and very inhospitable kinds of architecture to create a much more expansive and open-ended courtyard. In fact, during COVID, this was very, very heavily used for museum performances, musical performances, art openings. And the sense of capturing water, which you see in the right, and treating water in a very precious way was, I think, an important lesson for us to convey. At times in the evening, when it's a little bit cooler, there are functions that the museum hosts. So it's also a response to the kind of temporal quality that architecture can help, in a way, celebrate. There's a very shaded ascending stair. Obviously, you can also take an elevator that's also sheltered right off of the and adjacent to the stair. But the idea of providing shade during the very hot midday sun of this part of Florida was crucial. It was an opportunity to link both new and old. There is an embodied carbon in the existing building that we thought we should try to keep as much of. A place for musical performances, sort of a quiet room. We're finding that art exists at so many interconnected levels. At times it's purely visual, at times it's all about music. And here you can see the kind of giant stone brise soleil that further tempers the sun and provides an elevated shaded courtyard. Allows the museum to host other kinds of art and other kinds of events.
So thinking about climate and place, the real question is for many cities is how do we actually connect to waterfronts when they have been adapted to accommodate infrastructure like train tracks and highways, or in some cases just an industry that contaminated it. And in Seattle, there was a desire to, in a sense, for the Seattle Art Museum to connect the city to the water's edge through the lens of art. And for us, this was an opportunity to rethink what landform building could do and what managing, in a sense, our climate resources might yield. And so this sketch that we call our infrastructure X-ray was really not only looking at maybe embracing and understanding that all these flows needed to continue, but new flows that had been lost, like the creation of salmon habitat that we were interested in adding to the waterfront, were possibilities that could be in reciprocal response to each other rather than separation. So thinking systemically about landscape, about movement, about transportation, about contamination being managed, and water all took shape in as few moves as we could think of. In this case, a 200,000 cubic yard earthwork that wanders from the city to the water's edge. And where highway construction, in this case, mechanically stabilized earth, clad with seismically agile precast concrete panels, could actually ultimately set up an agenda to look, in this case, at the Olympic Mountains, which the park is named after, and see the lens of art as a collaborative agenda there too. And so too, the building itself is not closed off from the elements, but in fact unfolded just like the site. In this case, you can see the garage below and the Kunsthal above. And the point of crossing literally of a highway is one that is brought into focus simply by this point that reminds you that you were above infrastructure that is moving below you. And that connection and infrastructure is an invention of art, ecology, and public life.
Often we think of infrastructure as in pejorative terms, antithetical to urban life. And here, as Marion mentioned, it becomes an opportunity to celebrate art and also recognize the importance of infrastructure, whether it's cars or in this case, trains. So the pleasure of seeing a train slide up north from Los Angeles to Canada becomes an opportunity to think of the train not just as a mode of transportation, but perhaps as mobile art. And that kind of idea of seeing the train as mobile art also allowed us to work with a series of artists. In this case, the very beautiful piece called Seattle Cloud Cover by Teresita Fernandez allows a kind of protective, in a way, a protective edge that's both functional and artistically beautiful. But it's reclaiming the water that I think in some ways is what has given us great pleasure in this project. Reclaiming the water for, in a way, public use. It had been used only for parking. And now it's an opportunity that you see through careful engineering and working with biologists to reclaim that water for salmon habitat, which had been so important to the native cultures of this area several hundred years ago. And that sense, in a way that architecture can be responsive, or urban design can be responsive, and think of its role in terms of not just the hard infrastructure, but the softer infrastructure, the biological infrastructure that's so important and often absent to our urban settings. So here you see it at opening day, and of course the sort of landscape has since taken measure. During the summer, the grasses turn brown by intention to avoid excessive watering and excessive irrigation. So they create beautiful patterns that change, we hope, over the course of the seasons. I don't know if this film will work, but it's important also to think of the sounds of the city as having an architectural agenda. And it rains a lot in Seattle too. So Along with Gardens is a project very much on our minds. It's nearly complete, but it also, I think, is driven by a series of ecological measures, ecological agendas. And in this case, it was taking an existing greenhouse that for about 100 years has slowly fallen into disrepair, the greenhouse you see on the left, the multiple greenhouses. And the idea was to create a new greenhouse that would talk about climate change, the kind of plants that are likely to survive over the next 50, 100, 200 years, but also to do it in an ecologically sensitive way because glass houses consume a great deal of energy. So it was important to kind of rethink the paradigm of the glass house and in some ways look to nature to provide clues both in terms of the behavior climatically, but also structure. So the structure looks very much at how trees grow, the kind of synergies between the vertical and the horizontal branching of structures. So in a way, it's an homage to the kinds of trees that one finds nearby with their beautiful branching structures. But it also creates a level of efficiency in terms of how to kind of gather water off a roof, use that water to, in a way, activate what are a series of gardens that deal with the presence of water when there's too much, or the presence or lack of water when it's too little. This is now under construction, and it, in a way, is an opportunity to kind of think about climate change in a positive way. Think about also the beauty that might come as our kind of world changes, and how can we do that? Think about change in a much more positive way. So it creates a series of gardens that capture water, again, use water in a very precious way. And the building itself is both hopefully an aesthetic experience, but also a performative one, like the Brooklyn Botanic Garden. So there's an active shading system. There are geothermal wells that allow, and earth tubes that use the kind of mean temperature of the earth to kind of stabilize the interior of the conservatory. So the heating either on the upside or the downside can be minimized. Again, we capture water and try to use every single drop of it for a productive purpose. We're investigating with our clients here who are very interested in the ecology of waterborne plants and trying to use that as a way of thinking about where our world might be and how parts of that might induce a higher level of pleasure and a higher level of responsibility. The silhouette, of course, not only captures water, but also, we hope, symbolizes or recalls the very beautiful rolling hills that surround this project and are so distinctive. But then, of course, at night, it becomes a lantern that, in effect, turns the inside out and makes it visible. So moving closer to New York, New York has been under a great deal of pressure as a kind of urban city that's growing.
And as it grows, the kind of panoramic views that a place like Hunters Point South Waterfront Park has is really one that encompasses Manhattan, the East River, and Brooklyn. And also in many ways looks at an opportunity to reclaim a piece of the waterfront that had been, in a sense, contaminated by industry and really lost to public life. And yet, as the city had started to grow and the Bloomberg administration thought about our connections to the water, the question was, if we're going to create the largest affordable housing destination since the 70s in New York, what about thinking about creating the park first to draw the developers who would choose to invest in this area to make that commitment? And so you can see the site as it is. And what's interesting is it was, both part hardscape and part softscape, but in this case now an opportunity to create an urban infrastructure and one that could register the fact that the rising sea level and even the changing tidal nature of this river, if you will, really a strait, is really making the design of this fully informed by climate change. And in this case, you can see it's really looking at that question of how can we invite water in and how can that invitation of bringing the water in shape a new landscape. And Hurricane Sandy certainly affected New York's understanding of what it means to be literally at the water's edge. And so our thinking in the development of this master plan for the park, and then ultimately the design of it, was what would happen if we could welcome the water in and have that literally shape a public life and a public infrastructure that defended the development of housing beyond. So you can see that it's as much about welcoming the water in, a catch and release strategy, and also creating a recreational destination that directly opposite the school could actually amplify that possibility. Hunter College being able, and Hunter students being able to participate now along with the community in a landscape that had never really been available to anybody at the water's edge. In the pavilion itself, what you can start to see here is that it's solar facing. It collects water, it collects sun, and also it connects the community through the infrastructure of the waterway. And as we think about that operative term, not only is it collecting water to irrigate the park, but just like that round green that you saw, which is a huge cistern to gather water and to protect it, it's really a high-performing infrastructure. And it's one that in many ways, in this flat area with the hardened edge as a first phase, had the opportunity to really intensify the diversity of uses on the water's edge. But it truly also gave us a chance to recreate a beach that had been lost so that it could welcome families and not be lost to the tidal straits and changing climates, and reclaim the identity of the exchange, the rail yards that used to make this a place of exchange. So that place of exchange now is one of public life and nature coming together and connecting that life to the horizon of Manhattan beyond, and bringing into focus the connections and broader ones that had been unseen.
So phase two, these large urban projects take time occasionally and or often. So we were given the opportunity to continue the project in a second phase. And what we decided to do is to take the little bit of topography we had and really enhance it with a kind of giant promontory in Belvedere where families could gather. You could take in the beautiful view of New York City, look up and down, but also think of the project sectionally. Perhaps we could reclaim along the water's edge the very, very active and very important wetlands that had been erased through urban development. Now, creating a kind of platform is an interesting proposition. We were fortunate to work with Eric, which is a very, very sophisticated engineering company. This was actually built by boat builders and then trucked to the site and assembled, much as you might assemble a piece of marine infrastructure. So you can start to see the sort of sectional variations. Marion talked about inviting the water in. When there's high tide or a storm, the wetlands, which are nature's great way of absorbing water, and effectively they're green sponges, are reintroduced as a positive way of rethinking and using nature to deal with rising water levels and climate change. But it's also a beautiful place to walk along the water's edge. Literally, you can walk on the water at high tide. And then similarly, the Belvedere is a place that is more public. There are moments where you are in the middle of a very dense city, and yet you feel the presence of the nature that used to be there 500 years ago. At times, a peninsula becomes an island at high tide. So the sort of sense of capturing the dynamics and the changes along the water's edge becomes an opportunity to think about this project as a kind of a changeable, hopefully a changeable work of art. Here you can start to see this kind of public sort of setting up a great place for selfies, a great place to kind of gather families, a great place to take in the western promontory, the western prospect of the setting sun. Now we'll see if this film works. And again, the hope is that architecture can make evident and celebrate the changes that are so pleasurable with urban life. So the last project we'll talk about is a project that's particularly important to us, which is the reconfiguring the U.S. Embassy in New Delhi. And this will be a project that we're just finishing up the first phase, and there are multiple phases. So we will be coming to India quite often and with great anticipation. Some of you know Delhi. It's in effectively the kind of embassy district, which is a very verdant and very beautiful part of Delhi. But the U.S. Embassy was built a number of years ago in 1956, when it was really important for America to recognize the importance of India as a global country, global player. And so the U.S. government created a whole series of embassies, of which this is probably the most important of that era, designed by Edward Durrell Stone, who was very, very interested in acknowledging the incredible legacy of Indian architecture. But it was a very singular building that in many ways is a very important aspect to America's diplomatic history, and something that I think is an important project as your country has grown in such an incredibly fast way. So we were very humbled to be asked to redesign this complex. And it's one of the it's a campus, so it's in many ways an urban design challenge as well. But there are two important buildings, the Chief of Missions residence, the Ambassador's residence, and the Chancery. And these were projects that will ultimately be very carefully restored. So the sense that Mary and I had was to first immerse ourselves, like Edward Durrell Stone, in what we found so important and beautiful, in the sort of legacy of gardens and architecture that is part of India's history. And in a way, operate first with a light touch to identify a potential pattern that might yield a way of developing a project over many, many years. In fact, our hope is that this project will continue long after our phase is done. And it recognizes the importance of the garden as a unifier. In this case, it becomes a kind of tapis vert, a kind of green carpet that connects both some of the new buildings that we're designing as well as existing buildings. And that kind of connective link will hopefully play out and become the kind of primary axis that connects many, many buildings, both existing and new, over a very long period of time. But we were also very much taken by the material quality and your climate and the wealth of very beautiful stone that is quarried not very far away. So we're trying to use as many materials that are not coming from other countries or great distances. But we're also recognizing the importance of creating a kind of a perimeter in a positive way. Often embassies are treated as islands. So here the sense of invitation at the important street corner, creating a kind of private garden open to those who are interested in coming here and getting visas. So it's much more sheltered, much quieter. There are parts of the building that are below grade. So we're using the kind of sunken courtyard idea to thermally cool the building. And again, to provide a sort of interconnection between inside and outside that's so unique to great traditions of Indian architecture. And then, of course, there are more ceremonial areas that take on the beautiful forms that we just shared to create memorable spaces. And those spaces are animated through the kind of opportunity to collect water because of its preciousness, but also to provide shade. So we're planting close to 1,000 new trees and shrubs. You'd enter the compound in a more ceremonial way under a canopy of the Lonyx trees. The kind of royal palms that we found so beautiful at Lodi Gardens become a way of metering the central route, the sort of central axis. And you can see the building on the right being the kind of famous 1956 Edward Durrell Stone building. So it becomes the primary figure, the primary protagonist in the route. And it's also, much of the building is below grade, but we are capturing light through courtyards. So again, we're using the kind of the benefit of the thermal cooling of the earth to provide a kind of more even temperature, but also to keep the scale of the building lower, so that the Edward stone building is always the tallest element on the site. And these kind of lower courtyards, again, are kind of thought of as opportunities to bring in the kinds of plant materials, the sort of vegetation that one would typically find in this area of India.
And as we think about this, water had done many things that were probably thought primarily as symbolic in the late 50s by Edward Durrell Stone. But as we think about the thesis of form follows climate, for us, we were also interested in the indoor-outdoor connections. And in this case, where the new canopy on our new Chancery building and a skim of water, creating now an evaporative cooling at grade experience of arrival, where water no longer is just symbolic, but it's also operating on a level of actually changing the experience of arrival and drawing you in this case, to the walls that Michael described, were as much about shaping a precinct outside with gardens, but also shaping a destination inside for the community there. But what we're also very mindful of is that we need to build for resilience, both environmental and social resilience. And in that case, so we look very broadly now at the whole comprehensive idea of stormwater management on the campus. And where at the central reflecting pool, which had been a huge symbolic gesture in front of the Chancery building, but was losing so much water from evaporative cooling that it wasn't very useful, we were able to now excavate, and that excavation has already been completed now, nearly 2 Olympic-sized swimming pools worth of water collection. So during the monsoon season, water is collected and a thinner skim of water is always available there. But in fact, as we even think about the greatest risk of that reflection being lost, the stone beneath is polished so that we have reflective stone pool surface during the dry months, but generally speaking, during the wet months, it remains as designed, and yet it's much harder working. And so too, solar capture and shading becomes important. And so the perimeter of our buildings and the roof of our buildings are really performative. In this case, the perimeter really taking a hybrid, if you will, of brise soleil and the colonnade that we found so beautiful as something that supported the canopy of the Durrell Stone building. And through bringing those two languages together to still be able to amplify the views out the windows, but minimize the entry of direct sun, it's that combination then that is in dialogue with the original Chancery building and in dialogue with a new language, if you will, to manage light and vistas. And one where, in fact, that idea of engaging light and illumination is also thought through socially. So now, in this case, the canopy outdoors for the consular arrival and the connection with local artists are seen as one. And so when we think about it all together, the idea of really rejuvenating that commitment to our ties, the U.S. ties to India, couldn't be more important. And climate is part of it. So too are the public arrivals with restrooms now outside and entry pavilions in series, consular arrivals and shade in particular being something that begins right at that door before you even enter a consular garden, which is now an intensity of local plants and trees, and really a destination for engagement outside, artists being able to line that consular waiting area. And in this case, Bharti Kher's beautiful use of local stones is really creating now a pattern of art and engagement. And Spencer Finch, an American artist, really bringing a new identity to light as it travels through the arrival. And that arrival then leading to you to a place of connection, a place of engagement with the campus, a place of dialogue with the past, a place of architecture, landscape, nature, and climate coming together. And finally, the real question for us is how can form follow climate, or more importantly, how can climate inspire us to think of new ways to build with nature? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Marion and Michael. Really a wonderful walk through these projects, which really sort of enjoyed listening to all the different your interests, I think, which you bear to all of them, with bringing in public space, as you said, and the landscape. So I know it seems kind of effortless, but it must be a lot of tweaking to get it to blend so easily between, as you said, like, and it's sometimes also being like retaining walls, but breaking it down so that it also becomes a very accessible walkway, and again, how the public uses the space, how they can anticipate the space. And that's what I liked so much about the Diana Center was the before you enter the building, you can see how it is structured. And I think that's so important for, public buildings to be able to understand, because, the public goes in once or a few times. It's quite different from some, another kind of typology, but to understand the circulation, to understand the structure of the building is important. I mean, the structure as in the way it is architecturally structured, but no, thank you very much. I don't know if you have a minute. I'm sorry we started late, but if you have a minute or two to
Sure, of course.
yeah, to answer some questions. So I think there's one by Sean, which says, what are the key materials used in the U.S. Embassy project? So I think you talked about the Makrana marble, which is locally quarried, and the rest is sandstone, or?
So there are various sandstones.
Ambaji
There's
white.
Ambaji white is used. The building is primarily a concrete structure, so we're trying to kind of use as much of that concrete production on site, because often shipping concrete, moving it around is extremely expensive. There's a great deal of plaster work, which I think there's a great tradition of very beautiful plaster work. And then there's the idea of vegetation, which we actually have a nursery not too far away where trees are being grown, so they'll be mature enough to be transplanted and have the kind of quality of shade that's so important.
I mean, we often think about roofs in unique ways as building materials, because a third of the office space is covered with a green roof, and the carved courtyards are bringing light into those. And then the very top roofs are solar. And so these are both, in a sense, infrastructures, but part of the building material literally is energy creation or energy preservation by having the benefit of that earth mass around and on top.
The precast panels also use chips of white marble that otherwise would be thrown out. So the chips of white marble are used in the mix, which adds a little bit of sparkle
On the precast
precast panels, the kind of vertical woven precast panels. So often, when you grind up stone or when you cut stone, you're left with shards that are either pulverized or just tossed and become part of landfill. So we're trying to use some of that material in a way that gives the precast quality a very unusual sparkle.
Right. And the original building was precast, or what was the
original building was
yeah.
concrete, and it's
Precast terrazzo
precast terrazzo, using, I think, a lot of Ambaji white marble. There are a few other, one or two marbles, I can't remember the name, that are no longer available. And then obviously the Brise Soleil is a series of precast, the Jolly Screen precast terrazzo.
Yeah. So just a couple more questions. One is how different was working in the Indian climate and context? very different, I would imagine.
Very different. Having just returned from India a week and a half ago and experiencing the 100 degrees as actually, oddly enough, a very comfortable temperature because it's so dry. It really is the extremes that were important for us to understand. The extreme heat, the extreme rain, and also pollution being, in a sense, a protagonist of not only climate, but our opportunity to think about how to particularly in the burdened opportunity of the Garden District and the Embassy District to, in a sense, keep in mind that we're working in a very unusual climate. And so for us, it's trying to learn at the rate of a child wherever we are and be as humble as possible for as long as possible so that we don't make assumptions that lead to what we'd call identical blue box modernism around.
I will add, though, I think climate change is forcing the world in some ways to be more alike. But Florida, obviously very different. So it's not India, but it's not unusual to have extraordinarily strong hurricanes, heavy rains. There is a rainy season, and the heat extremes are more extreme. So in some ways, that climate we discovered is not so different from certain parts of India. Of course, India's, as you know, a huge country with many different kinds of ecosystems and climates. But extreme rain and extreme heat in that part of Florida is becoming much more the norm than the exception.
Right. Okay, I think there's one last question. Says we see a lot of water that is captured and rescued as pools, transparency, and using the use of form to create interest in your projects. Can you point to a few differences between your projects in the US and that in India due to differences in climate, air quality, and differences in construction quality and the resources in India?
It's a very interesting question. And I think one of the things that became a very unusual opportunity in India at the US Embassy was to think about not only climate, but also think about culture. And in this case, if we look back 60 years ago to what Edward Durrell Stone was inspired by, he was inspired by the architecture, and the architecture is one that already intrinsic to the past had a notion of really how to connect symbolism, but also be mindful that there was no such thing as air conditioning, and there was no such thing, if you will, as stormwater management. And so these things were done far more thoughtfully, but for us, the inspiration was that these were done with the idea that form and climate together could become meaningful in a public way. We've drawn inspiration, say, of the Indian temple Agrasan Kiboli, which in many ways, through carving into the earth, created a place where the temperature drops as you descend, and water is being treated both as a resource, but also as a precious way to gather a community, and now, in a sense, literally change the climate outdoors. So for us, there were far more examples in India than we've ever seen in the United States, where nature and climate and materials have been considered together to create something extraordinary. And I think we are humbled, in a sense, by the examples of the past, which are far deeper and richer in India than, in a sense, our very young country has.
Yeah, I think that's an important thought to just reflect on. I was born, as Nandita, you mentioned, in a country that's very old. The United States is relatively young, and India is a country that has an incredibly rich tradition, and it allowed us, who aren't familiar with your tradition, to really learn about the kind of lessons. And for example, even as India develops, I think maybe some of the great lessons are lost in some of the new construction, but the idea of mass being actually a great way to stabilize temperature extremes. That doesn't happen often in the US. Everything's highly standardized, it's thin, it's pre-assembled. And what we're finding is there's a certain efficiency to building that way in a certain speed, but environmentally, it's a disaster. These very thin buildings are heat, they lose heat in the winter and they gain way too much in the summer. So in India, we're trying to, wherever possible, use the thicknesses of walls to mitigate those temperature extremes. And that's been a very valuable lesson that I hope is also not lost in your newer constructions.
Well, thank you very much, both Marion and Michael, really for wonderful talk, and thank you for answering these questions too. Because I think on that note, which is really about lessons for all of us to learn and in our buildings. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Pleasure and an honor.
An honor. Thank you for including us.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hope you all have a nice evening.
Thanks. Okay, so now to move on. We have the rest of the evening, and we'll get to it very quickly, the second part of the evening, which is the award ceremony for the Charles Correa Gold Medal. This medal is given for an undergraduate thesis from any of the 400 architectural colleges across India. The focus was on ecologically sensitive architecture, and we received quite a range of entries. It's a two-stage competition. A student is selected by the college, who then sends the thesis to us. And this year, 61 colleges registered to send in entries. A few fewer actually sent them. So I don't know what exactly the process was that got delayed in that. But it's free to enter. We just need the college to register the thesis as done by their student as a way to have that first initial selection. And then they are submitted to us, and we have a panel of 5 jury members who then select the prize winner. We have also, over the last few years, made an archive of the submitted theses on our website. So students in preparation for their final semester can go through these as references. This is called the Storehouse, and it's on our website. We have the gold medalist with a prize, of course, of the gold medal and of rupees 25,000, and then 2 honorable mentions. CCF invited, as I said earlier, 5 architects to be on the jury, who I will introduce. More detail of their bios, because they're very accomplished jurors, are available on our website, charlescorreafoundation.org. The first, Professor Sanjeev Vidyarthi, he serves as head of the Department of Urban Planning and Policy at the University of Chicago. He chaired the jury. Mustansif Dalvi, who just recently retired, but he was the longest serving professor of architecture at the University of Mumbai at the JJ College of Architecture. And while at the JJ, he hosted the jury on several occasions when they met in person, with Charles being very much part of that jury, I understand. He was, it was a time when the jury reviewed drawings printed on boards, unlike today. So Mustansif's connection to the gold medal has most likely been the longest, because I wasn't part of those juries or had anything to do with it at that time. So Mustansif's, it's nice to have him back in the process. Bhavna Hamid is a co-founder of Playgroup Studio in Goa, and earlier worked with the Chinese artist Ai Weiwei. And this has greatly influenced her thinking and practice. She says, and she's also had been the associate director of the Charles Correa Foundation in 2013-14, where she worked with Charles on various urban projects in Goa. Rajmohan Shetty practices and teaches in Bangalore, where He has lived for the last 2 decades. Earlier, he taught at the RPI in New York, studied at MIT and stuff, and also a very good architect, a very articulate architect as well. Manijay Verghese is director of Sphere Spaces, and it's a design and curatorial practice, and based in London. She was co-curator of the Garden of Privatized Delight, which was the 2021 British Pavilion at the Venice Architectural Biennale. So I'm now going to hand it over to the members of the jury who will give away the awards. So over to Sanjeev, who was not able to join us today. So his is a recorded statement, but then the others will speak live to you. Yeah.
Excellent to see fantastic work happening all across the country. This is something that came both as a pleasure and both as a joy. It was also nice to sort of see steady improvement in student work over time. For example, recently I did some work for GSAIN Trophy in NASA, and I saw students work from different parts of the country. But then it sort of shows that there is an intellectual progress in the profession over time, from compared to when I went to school or later works that I've seen. I found the work, and so did many other jury members, that the quality of work has continued to improve. And in a broader sense, if younger folks are not doing better than the previous generations, then that's not a good idea, right? I mean, human evolution evolves that the future generations continue to do better work than the generations that have preceded them. So in this sense, I want to start by thanking the students for composing their fantastic work in legible and articulated manner that was easy to understand. To the CCF crew, the Charles Correa Foundation team for doing excellent work for organizing and curating the materials for jurors. And then also to my fellow jurors for their labor of love, judging the wonderful entries and devoting their labor and time. Our collective work was also rewarding in the sense that we came across many stimulating cutting-edge design concepts as well as practically grounded solutions that sort of sought to balance both often competing considerations of efficiency and aesthetics. So overall, wonderful work. This the effort that the jury put in was worth the reward for everyone in this particular sense. Broadly, what caught my attention was, Charles oftentimes, he spoke of this issue, and then the bulk of his intellectual life was spent in the pursuit of an architecture which was appropriate both for an ancient country and that was simultaneously a young modern nation. So, and that's a pursuit that stands very clear. And I think that would make Charles very happy if he was to see this echo. And for me personally as well, I found utter joy in finding the echoes of Charles' quest of, the pursuit of an architecture that is both appropriate for an ancient country as well as a young modern country on the move. And it sort of balances and tries to seek that kind of thing. It's not only alive, but this pursuit is thriving. For example, a good example of this would be we sort of set out to look for how climate, how form of a building follows climate, but we were extremely happy to see that many of the students reinterpreted the idea of climate and sort of expanded our conventional understanding of climate to include climate change. And then this is something that sort of shows, the evolution of the thought based on the context, both local as well as policy that changes, and folks were designing accordingly. Finally, such good quality, inspiring work. And this is very important. And I think that's at the heart of what the CCF tries to do, is to sort of bring this excellent quality, inspiring works from across the nation to the fore. It gives us hope that in these times of ongoing turmoils and disruptions of various kinds, we continue to do, and especially the younger generation continues to do fantastic work. So from this perspective, all best to all the participants, because the work was uniformly good, but only a few could win. But collective work overall, in totality, was uniformly impressive. Thank you.
Okay, so now we move to the first honorable mention, or one of the two honorable mentions, which Bhavna will announce. Bhavna, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Nandita, and thanks, Charles Correa Foundation, for this opportunity. It was quite an interesting experience to see the whole spectrum of projects which came in. If I may, I think it was also a window for us to see how education in architecture is different across the nation. So, very broadly speaking, there were two kind of projects. One where, or it's two distinct ambitions, let's say. One where it was more about demonstrating the skill of the making of a building, like a craftsman, and the efforts were more on the structure, the tectonics, the details. And then there were another set of projects which were more about raising the question through their projects. It was not really anymore the scale of the building or the details. It was more about sort of questioning, reinventing what architecture is. And I think the winners today are people who have sort of done justice to both sides of these very important aspects of architectural education. And I'm really happy to announce the winners. I'm going to start by announcing the first honorable mention. It goes to the project Impermanence in Architecture, a case of Premabai Hall, by students Sri Vibhu Viraj from LS Raheja School of Architecture. This is a project where he has considered climate as considered change as a constant in any context, and that includes climate as well, which is susceptible to continuous change. And therefore, he's looked at his building as sort of a continuous process rather than an output or a solution, a final output or a solution. I'm just going to read the citation from the panel after the selection. Impermanence in Architecture, a case of Premabai Hall. Designing a building inspired by a narrative of time is an intriguing concept. The project prompts us to think about impermanence and the conceptual development of our own ideas as we go through space and time. What sets this project apart is how the project continues to evolve after construction, blending into its surroundings and influencing the locality. Beginning with a bold "what if" premise, it reinterprets Premabai Hall's existence, allowing the design to articulate its own narrative. This proposal reintegrates itself into the surrounding and talks about the broader impact of the building. The design incorporates climate considerations for longevity, depicted vividly through captivating storyboards, portraying the building as a dynamic entity. I would now request CCF, someone to just screen the project for the audience.
Hello, Impermanence in Architecture, the case of Premabai Hall. Nature as a medium has a lot to offer, such as its force and ability to drastically transform. People change, context changes, climate changes, times change. Then why shouldn't architecture be planned in such a manner to sustain this change and stay relevant with the changing times? While designing in the Anthropocene, it's essential for one to recognize the dichotomy that exists between permanence and impermanence. It allows one to develop a better notion of people, place, and space. Perceiving design as a continuous state of transition that acts as a possible alternative solution to this change is the key to this idea. The case of Premabai Hall is considered as a hypothetical what-if scenario understanding for this modular idea to be implemented in an exciting context as rich and dynamic as the old city of Ahmedabad, the Bhadra Plaza. Starting from a blank slate, the time period when the hall was commissioned in the 1960s, the design program is envisioned as an alternative approach of design, where the life of the building, being an auditorium, is mapped through a series of potential events while taking cues from the timeline of the context and thus framing it in the form of a storyline method. This allowed a better understanding of the change that accompanied a built form while questioning its relevance from time to time. The interventions thus planned are responses for the building to stay relevant and for it to sustain the changing times. Form follows climate. Form building is a response to its climate. The planning of the auditorium is done in a manner to respond to the climate as well as the changing times. Primary construction techniques with a futuristic understanding that the change it may undergo are used strategically for making the whole built form more responsive and adaptable. The age of innovation aimed at building an identity, the age of increased demand aimed at accommodating density and trends, the age of heritage renewed the historical essence of the plaza, and the age of interpretation left scope for the futuristic growth of the precinct in a self-sustainable manner. Each phase adds on to the mapping of sustainability in the life of this built entity, thus allowing it to evolve. The thesis is not looking at this storyline as something that challenges the existing, but rather draws attention towards possibilities that could be explored. However, phase 4 is not looked at as the end of the story, rather a milestone in the development of this plaza into a new age cultural hub woven around a built form and auditorium. The intention of the thesis never began from a climate sensitive approach, nor did it end at just that. Rather, it aimed and touched upon a larger picture where a sensitive design made more sense to achieve a sustainable model over time.
Well, congratulations, Shri Vibhu. That's really was a very, very interesting project what you took on. We now go to the other honorable mention, which Raj Shetty will introduce. Raj.
Okay. Thank you. I've had some problems with my camera, so apologies for that. But let me get down to the task at hand. An honorable mention has been awarded to Komal Prabhakar Pavaskar of the School of Architecture, AIKPC, or the Anjuman Islam Kalsekar Technical Campus based in Navi Mumbai. The project titled Replace addresses issues of rehabilitation in a flood-prone area along the river Belki in Assam. I will quote the jury citation regarding this project. Quote, the design concept effectively translates the theme of replace, offering a simple yet elegant solution to a long-standing challenge. Rooted in its use of local materials, community engagement, and multi-species integration, the project demonstrates a strong foundation and contextual sensitivity. With a clear focus on reinventing the vernacular, it showcases a thoughtful approach to addressing local needs through extensive site work and understanding of user requirements. This project represents a modest yet conscious resolution to a significant problem in that region. Unquote. In conclusion, I would add that the project reflects a kind of light, lean, and taut design thinking, shorn of the extraneous. It is a finely nuanced reasoning as a play between the intuitive, logical, and the anthropological. The anthropological being close observations of daily community life. The final outcome reflects these qualities, and therein lies its elegance. Thank you.
The title of my topic is Replace, to create a makeshift multipurpose space for the people in Kharbali village in Assam. The selected area for the study lies in the Kharbali village in the Barbeta district of Lower Assam. The shifting course of river Beki causes flooding and river erosion, affecting the local populace, making them displaced along with their livestock. In the year 2022, the only lower primary school in the Kharbali village got affected due to river erosion. With the help of an NGO, a sketching activity was organized where we asked students to create the school of their dreams. Decoding the handmade sketches helped me understand the requirements and led me to the strategies of the form development. The module is considered and repeated to create the entire space. Ramps are being provided considering the livestock movement during floods. In between spaces are the circulatory spaces which can be used for panchayat meetings, for other ceremonies as well, bringing people to celebrate togetherness, whereas during floods, the space are used for parking boats and rafts. The stilt is been provided for the water to flow without blocking the energy. The upper space works as a relief center during floods, while on the regular days it functions as the classrooms. The area below the stilt on level 1 functions as a space for indoor activities and as a leisure space, whereas during floods, livestock and fodders can be kept. The form of the structure is inspired by considering case studies from Chang houses in Mazuli, the local materials found in surroundings, not only human-centric but living-centric approach where animals are considered as crucial part as well.
Okay, well, congratulations, Komal. And now to Mustansir to announce the gold medalist.
Thank you. It's a great honor and privilege to be able to make this announcement. And of course, I have to thank the Charles Correa Foundation for asking me to do so. The jury process was a very enjoyable and a very collegial one in which there was a lot of discussion about the various projects that were presented to us. And I'm happy to say that the gold medal winner was more or less by consensus. Everybody appreciated the work that was done here. Before I announce the winner of this year's gold medal, I would just like to say that in a very solid sense, I think the people who have been shortlisted and have participated in this competition are tomorrow's practitioners. And I say this in a very positive way because these are the people whom we should really look forward to in the future as practitioners of architecture in our country. The way in which they have done so is by, and you can make this out very clearly through their work and through their choices and through their approaches, challenges the current forms of practice that have been sort of, mired very since the first half of the last century. The kind of proprietorial practice, the kind of practice that looks at, architects working towards design, clients coming to architects and approaching them, and then the buildings being built on site. This standard kind of model is very clearly being shaken by some of the work that we saw in this competition because it requires a different kind of practice and a different kind of approach, or rather many different kinds of approaches to look at the architecture of the future. In our country, and to a certain extent, this is very much in synthesis with the presentations which we just saw by the architects Weiss and Manfredi, where there is an ambiguity created between architecture as built form, the site, landscaping, and infrastructure. All these are seen simultaneously to create the responses of the future. This is one very important and positive thing that we saw in several of the projects, including, as you have already seen, in the projects that have got an honorable mention. The other important aspect is a unique kind of agency that the students who are architects of tomorrow have provided for themselves in the manner in which they go about doing their designs, or their role in the realization of the designs in the future. which is much more than, an ivory tower kind of thing. And this is very much by going down into the field itself. A lot of these projects will only be possible through public participation. A lot of these projects look at the users as the clients rather than the money bags as the clients. It was nice to see when we looked at all the entries that there were not that many projects where you had either the state or the corporates as the clients, but the clients actually emerged from the users themselves, the base of users themselves. And I think that is a very positive thing. So all told, I think the manner in which the interpretation of the brief form follows climate was done by several of the shortlisted entries was unique in that sense. And particularly unique is the winner as well. So it is my great privilege to announce the winner of the Charles Correa Gold Medal for this year. And the winner's name is Dhruv Sachala from the School of Environment and Architecture, Bombay. The advisors are Rupali Gupte and Apurva Talpade, and the project is called The Architecture of Incrementality. Let me read the citation, the jury citation. The project Architecture of Incrementality demonstrates a strategic approach to sustainability and incrementality, unfolding step by step. The project's toolkit stands out for its scalability and context sensitivity. Its innovative approach to construction, focusing on reusing and reinventing elements, resonates deeply with the broader climate context, empowering communities with adaptable components. It tackles a universal language by offering not just finished buildings, but a versatile kit of parts, enhancing its global significance. This paradigm shift in the architect's role is truly remarkable and beautifully depicted through its visual representation. The project looks at incremental housing that can happen uh, in what today are called slums in Bombay, especially in an area called Malwani, which has some very congested pockets of self-help housing, and looks at the creation of new architecture from the ground up in terms of the users, in terms of the design inputs, and in terms of the idea of incrementality. The project is particularly important because a lot of it is conceived through reusing parts which come from probably different parts of the city, which are then kind of fitted in as is mentioned, a kit of parts approach. And there is a certain porosity in this kind of design that recognizes the fact that in very, very congested kind of situations, you need to create a much more breathable material facade or kind of roofing system so that the people who are living within these spaces can have better comfort conditions. So all these have come together very, very beautifully, and especially beautifully in terms of the presentation and the drawings as well. So I would request that the little film of the project be shown before we take this further.
Design thesis looks to intervene in existing process of architecture practiced in various parts of the country. 95% of architecture evolves incrementally, mobilizing multiple forces. It follows a very nuanced and intermittent way of transforming their built form, shaped by diverse social and economic influences. The organic growth involves continuous non-linear transformation that respond to the inhabitants' need. The site is located in Malad, Malamni, one of the suburbs in the suburbs of Mumbai, one of the place named Noori Masjid. The thesis looks at it at a macro level while changing the space around the ground, the boundary wall, and also at a micro level while changing the inhabitation or in detail. This is one of the case study of the houses from the site where it looks at the transformation of the house while the ground floor is rented by Naseem and the first two floors are used for himself and the second floor used for himself as a workshop. The toolkit is a set of specific and surgical architectural intervention techniques that allow for rethinking of fundamental elements of the building and functionality such as walls, fenestrations, foundation, etc. to improvise the conditions of the neighborhood through the lens of ventilations, light, ventilation and sanitation. The toolkit further opens up Naseem's house, which is the case study and built by improving the conditions through the idea of the toolkit. The structure is created with a thin frame of steel and then the fenestrations are added as a skin, which are the windows scaled at 1:3 level, aluminium frame window scaled at 1:3 level and bring in the light inside the structure. The whole front facade is opened up with thin skins which can be weighed or removed, and then the staircase is wrapped around the space so that it directly takes you to the first floor. The whole building is like a sponge which comes in and goes out and blurs the difference between the inside and outside.
So let me once again congratulate the winner of the Charles Correa Gold Medal 2023. Congratulations, Dhruv Sachala of the School of Environment and Architecture.
Thanks, Musansir. Thank you, all the jury, and really congratulations, Dhruv. And we will contact you and the two honorable mentions, Komal and Shri Bhubi, to tomorrow to work out a date to meet in person. The gold medal really acknowledges the work of also the thesis advisors and the faculty who help prepare the students to be professional architects. And thank you too to the jurors for your rigorous review of the submissions, and to the UDRI for their contribution of having some of the medals minted, and they gave them to us. So we're grateful for that sponsorship. But I'd also like to just say a few words to the students who have just finished their thesis and are listening, and they're sort of now embarked on their professional career. To those who are yet in their thesis semester or have yet to do the thesis, a thesis is a really important sort of moment. It's a very important semester. It's an important part of your education to really be able to delve into a project that you formulate. And has been said, it's something you should really take an opportunity to develop in a way. You really get that kind of opportunity to be able to control something to that extent. But the nourishment you get from that really does take you forward for many, many years until you build other experiences. But use the your advisors, get as much information as you can about that, but really take projects that will help define you. And a lot of this, not just the gold medalists, but the honorable mentions, was the projects that they took to explore. And that's really important. So anyway, looking forward to the next iteration of the gold medal and submission. So if your school hasn't been participating, do get them to participate. Every school in India is invited. As I said, it's free. It's just something that really should be done, and it's a very good input. I'd also just like to thank the CCF team in Panjim, Tanvi, Snehal-Lakshmi, Suyashi, Sean, Natalina, and Sogam, who have helped put, and with all the organization to put together the gold medal event and today's ceremony. Thank you very much. Thank you to everyone listening in, and thanks again to the jury. Thanks, Bhavna and Mustansir. Thanks, yeah. Bye.